And the first panel of the afternoon is a discussion on baseload 2.0, geothermal, advanced nuclear, and the race for 24/7 clean powering the AI. One of the big topics of the day, artificial intelligence and the opportunities and challenges it presents. And of course, one of those is powering it. Welcoming to the stage then for this discussion, we have Josh Dienstag, CIO at Carbon Direct Capital. We have Carl Hoiland, CEO of Zanskar. Andrew Scott, CEO of Orbital Marine Power. Analia Troncoso Ceola, Global Head of Strategy, Business Development and Sustainability, Motion Business Area at ABB. And to moderate this session, we welcome to the stage Gabriel Scheer, Senior Director, Investments and Innovation at Elemental Impact. So let's a round of applause and welcome them to the stage. Over to you.
Are we working? Yeah, we're here. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We have a great panel here to talk about, as mentioned, well, the name, Baseload 2.0, Geothermal, Advanced Nuclear, and the race for 24/7 clean power. We're going to take it a little bit different in terms of direction, not least because we actually don't have anyone on the panel who represents a nuclear company. We maybe should pull up the previous speaker and have her do it, but figured we'd jump right in, and given the premise here of Baseload 2.0 and the obvious hype and energy around AI and data centers, the first question, we're going to jump right in on that. But before we do that, I mentioned already the different backgrounds. So we're going to run through quickly backgrounds on everybody, if you could, and then we're going to jump into the question exploring how are we actually going to do this. So maybe Carl, start with you.
Hi, everyone. It's fantastic to be here. I appreciate having the stage with the panelists. I'm Carl Hoiland, co-founder and CEO of Zanskar. Zanskar is a next-generation geothermal energy company based in Salt Lake City, backed by about $200 million in venture financing, from including some folks that are here today, Obvious Ventures and Just Climate and others. And the thing that's really, within what some have called the Cambrian explosion of geothermal technologies that have really come to bear over the last few years, it's really a smorgasbord. What has set us apart and given us a pretty unique role is that we are the first to have shown that artificial intelligence, especially the latest architectures that we built in-house, are capable of finding, discovering, and de-risking geothermal resources at a speed, cost, and scale that simply wasn't possible before. And so whereas we've thought for decades that the industry was mostly tapped out and that without the ability to artificially engineer new systems, there wouldn't be much more to do, we've been able to show over the past few years that actually there's probably orders of magnitude more than we previously estimated and that governments have been estimating, and by our latest estimates, enough to meet all of the coming load growth demand. And so that's sort of the space that we play. We're vertically integrated developer IPP in the United States.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, so good afternoon. I'm Andrew Scott. I'm the CEO for Orbital Marine Power. We're a UK-based vertically integrated energy company. Kind of gate crashing this because obviously in the title there wasn't title, but we think we're warranted here. So the technology you can see on the screen there is not a spacecraft and it's not AI generated. This is the world's most powerful tidal turbine, which we operate off the north coast of Scotland. So I think the one thing that everybody probably generally understands, even though they're not a seafarer, is that the tides follow a very distinct pattern, which is determined by the orbit of the moon and the sun, or the Earth around the sun, I should say. So we play in that unique space from a decarbonisation journey perspective, and that 24/7 is that we're not linked to the weather. We can predict exactly how much power we'll produce at any single point, and we can predict how much power, we can even warrant how much power we'll be generating over a period of time. So hopefully be some interesting contribution from a new field for some of you today.
Go for it, Josh.
Hey everyone, I'm Josh Dienstag, the Chief Investment Officer of Carbon Direct Capital. We're a growth stage equity investor out of New York. Our focus is investing in technology companies that meet the economic and energy efficiency goals of hyperscalers. I think that's why I got invited. And one distinguishing feature about how we invest is we do have a separate but affiliated technical consulting firm that employs 70 scientists. with whom we partner to help us with technology due diligence on companies like the ones we'll be talking today.
Anna, saving the best for last.
Great. Anna Troncoso. I'm the Global Head of Strategy, Business Development, and Sustainability for ABB. And I think I was invited because I can't speak about geothermal and nuclear. I'm not a technical person, but we serve those markets. ABB, we are a leader in electrification, automation, and digital solutions. We operate in over 120 countries. And again, in terms of baseload, we are operating from grid to chip at the intersection of data centers, energy developers, and OEMs, and hyperscalers. So the unprecedented demand of energy, we call it energy expansion, is any source of energy that you can get a hold of. And in the US, Canada, the US, and in Europe, Middle East, and Asia as well, we're partnering with customers across all of those sources of energy. Geothermal and both traditional and advanced nuclear SMRs are two examples.
I feel like that's the sound of firm baseload, like happening around us right now. Well, great. You heard the introductions. Obviously, a wide variety of backgrounds here, and that's why we're going to start with a pretty broad question, which is if the idea here is baseload 2.0, how are we going to do this massive expansion of power amidst a whole bunch of other geopolitical and other constraints in the world right now? What are all of your takes? Let's just start there. How are we going to do this? What are going to be the key tech? How is it going to roll out? Play it out for us.
I'll start.
Go for
that's
it.
easy. I mean, so if we have the premise that we're going to need 100 gigawatts more to power AI, and we're talking about adding supply, which I think is only part of the solution, I can give more of a North American perspective, which is, I think, only one of the voices for the panel. But 80% of AI deployments are in the United States, so I think it's important to factor that in. My answers might be a bit different, but the answer is more of everything. It's not like either or. There's a menu of clean firm offerings that investors, I think, are evaluating across a number of different evaluation criteria. Based on our insights and our checks, it's actually not cost. It's time to power. I think that's a really good guiding criteria for how the hyperscalers think. How can you get on baseload quickly at scale? And through that lens, like the relative attractiveness of some of these solutions is quite stark, actually. I would say, and again, these are just our views, but probably the weakest on time to power would be the next gen nuclear like fusion. And if you meet fusion companies, they're talking about first commercial plants maybe in mid 2030s. So I actually think it screens, I think the panel's a bit mislabeled that fusion would be a majority of the solution for powering AI this decade. At the other end of the spectrum, I think what we see, again in the United States, is gas. Gas is going to be the lion's share of the practical deployments, either behind the meter or not. We've got significant sponsorship from the administration and the energy majors to bring gas online. An addition would be carbon capture attached to nat gas. So we call that, sending a blue electron to the grid. Google's got a flagship project, the Broadwing project in Illinois, which I think is a great case in point of how that kind of deployment is going to look. And then I think the other one that we're quite excited about is geothermal. And it's great to have Carl on the stage. Just in summary, you've got significant administrative support, new granting programs, PPAs being signed by hyperscalers, power being delivered today, and strategic investments by leaders like Ormat. So I think I defer because I think in Europe it might look quite a bit different on the mix of near-term solutions that are going to power AI.
Yeah, well, it's a big question there you put. So, I mean, I think we know the technologies that are going to do the heavy lifting, in solar and wind globally. But even at that, we recognize that there's variation in abundance, and one size doesn't fit all. So I think that's part of the renewable journey, is that it will play to the favor of certain technologies in certain spaces. When we talk about 24/7, you definitely have to then be including long-duration energy storage, things like that. I refer to it kind of like as a tapestry. You know, it's going to be a rich tapestry, and for an entrepreneur, I think that brings huge amounts of opportunity. And you know, Europe, we're definitely with a different dynamic, because I think you know, current events recognise, but even without that invasion of Ukraine and things, Europe is definitely sharply focused on sovereignty and security of supply, and gas doesn't give that particularly. So whilst gas can play technically a role in gap filling, there's an exposure there, security exposure for Europeans. So I think, yeah, it's going to be a rich tapestry of solutions that fill in those gaps, and it won't be one size fits all everywhere.
I mean, it's an interesting point. Josh, you brought up the time horizon piece on fusion, and I'm curious, Carl, what's your take with geothermal as relates to this question, right, of baseload 2.0? Geothermal, as you said, is undergoing rather an explosion of a whole bunch of different technologies, maturing very quickly around the same time. Where do you see it going?
Yeah, I think actually many of us, even within the geothermal industry who've been watching it closely, have been surprised at how much faster it achieved the key milestones than we were expecting. So I think we were also a little caught off guard of, actually it's time to go, and we probably should have been doing a little more preparation for the build out. But we think about it across really two axes. One is this time at which we're really going to have that big role, and then two is what role will we play within the grid mix and within this tapestry. On the time scale, there's a need right now. NVIDIA revised upwards their revenue forecast just a couple weeks ago by, $500 billion. So when you just think of what they're expecting to deliver by the end of next year, you're looking at another 50 plus gigawatts of firm power demand. That's not going to be geothermal, it's not going to be nuclear, unfortunately. So I do think we have to rely on these other existing solutions. But when you look in that kind of 2 to 5 year time frame, that's actually very realistic for geothermal to ramp up, because we have something that many of these other novel technologies don't have, which is an almost ready-to-go workforce that is at global scale and at massive efficiencies. So if you just took the entire global oil and gas rig fleet that is capable of drilling geothermal wells and switch them over tomorrow, we could be adding hundreds of gigawatts of firm geothermal power every year. That'd be more actual delivered electrons than all of solar globally that was added last year. So that ability to not have to rebuild that from scratch like we're going to have to do in nuclear and others, I think is one of the few reasons why we'll be able to ramp that curve faster than many other technologies will do. But then when you start looking at that 5 or really 10-year time frame, I think there's a lot of interesting advances in long-duration storage and fusion, fission, and so on. And so it's harder for me to see that far out. But I do think in this 5-year time frame, geothermal is really underappreciated and underrepresented in the conversation right now.
That's great. And Anna, I'm curious, taking a different and a more European perspective, to Josh's point, you've got 80% of the data centers happening in the US. How do you see the tapestry, as Andrew put it, looking differently here? And what do you see as the existing or emerging opportunities for firm baseload here?
Yeah, so building on that, I think 2 things are critical to win in this market and to solve for the energy demand that AI-ready data centers are requiring. One, and I think Josh mentioned it, early partnership across the value chain. But early, even before you start designing, because every hyperscaler is tailoring their solution to make sure wherever they build a data center, what is the available energy source that I have, what do I need to build, blah, blah, blah. So in our experience, we're partnering with all of the hyperscalers and at the same time partnering with the energy developer. The other thing that we're doing inside the data center through electrical, we have a solution which is DC power, which consumes much more less energy. And in the cooling, the liquid cooling particularly, we have AI solutions that significantly reduce the amount of energy. So all of that goes into the design, both the electrical, mechanical, and the whole, I would say, equation helps reduce energy consumption. At the same time, we also work at the grid level. We have synchronous condensers, which for those of you who are not technical, imagine they are massive spinning machines like motors that introduce stability in the grid. What happens with the grid, and I think this happened in Spain last year, is that when you try to combine different sources of renewables gas, the grid may become unstable, and then you have power outages. Synchronous condensers avoid that by introducing that stability, removing the noise from the various sources of energy, and introducing that stability that the grid requires to operate under those circumstances. Examples, again, if I go back to geothermal and nuclear, which again, I agree that by themselves, they're not going to provide all of the energy that is required. But again, I mentioned before, we see an energy expansion. All sources of energy are valid, and over the last 18 months, we have customers on geothermal and nuclear that we haven't had in years, in ages. An example also in Utah, we have partnered with Fervor Energy, who's building a geothermal plant over there. Canada, they're bringing back, both Canada and the US bringing back traditional nuclear, uranium enrichment. Even the policy, the regulatory and approval framework has been simplified in order to accelerate the approval of new projects. So a lot of momentum, a lot of opportunity, again, across the value chain.
Okay, you just touched on a few things I'd love to dig in a little more on. One is the regulatory environment and how that's changing. Two is the efficiency side of things. And Josh, you mentioned earlier making more use of what we have. And I think you could make a lot of touch points on that, whether it's the grid itself and grid optimization, whether it's things like demand shifting or load shifting across a lot of things, including the data centers themselves. Curious where you all see some of the lower hanging fruit there around, again, efficiency, regulatory change, what needs to happen even in the shortest term to make things work until we get to that 3 to 5 year horizon or the 10-year horizon or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think these are tough questions. I think we've talked about bringing on more supply through private capital and offtakes, and I absolutely agree with Anna on everything grid efficiency. But the energy system isn't very flexible, and it's pretty bureaucratic. And the idea of a relatively stagnant energy system all of a sudden hyperscaling, I think it's actually quite unlikely to go as we all hope. A third avenue that we talk a lot about at our firm, how about we just use less power? It's a lot easier than upgrading the energy system. And I think it's important, like you can just go to the NVIDIA website. I mean, one Blackwell chip has a thermal capacity of about 1,400 watts. And all these forecasts, you see SemiAnalysis and the Wall Street build up the forecast for the total energy consumption of the fleet based on multiplying through by how many hundreds of thousands of GPUs that are going to get purchased by NVIDIA and times that kind of energy quotient. We're trying to invest in chip innovation where you could complete those amount of computations for radically less energy. We made one investment in a company called Neurophos out of Texas that's using a completely new paradigm for GPU design that has the promise of like 1/100th of the energy. So I'd much rather just drop in a more energy efficient chip into the same server and the same data center on the same grid than go through these gymnastics or make an assumption that grid reform and other regulatory changes will happening. There's been other, I think, capital market successes, including that NVIDIA just acquired Grok in December, and that Cerebras just raised like $1 billion of Series H financing from some of the best firms in the world. So I think to us, like that's a relatively more exciting area that would be an additional supplement to more clean, firm supply and grid reform.
Yeah, I love that idea of focusing on the efficiency because we have good precedents for this having worked in the past. An area where we knew there was a true ceiling was water usage. Okay. And we're still very concerned about AI's water usage, but we are using 50 times less water than just 6 years ago per token processed through AI. We're offsetting that with the systems becoming more powerful through reasoning and agentic layers. So we're actually still using about the same amount of water per query, but it's remarkable to see how much that cap actually forced us to look for efficiencies in the system. And if we thought about energy in the same way, recognizing how impossible that ceiling is to lift at least in the next few years, that might help with that. An example we had, recognizing that most of our development pipeline are stuck in interconnection queues, right? Many years long, waiting to get onto the grid, but we have a lot of resource that would happily deliver tomorrow if it could. We focused on looking at underutilized assets that are already on the grid. So we had an example in New Mexico where we acquired a geothermal power plant that had been underperforming for years and was actually about to be decommissioned and shut down. And our models had been pointing to the possibility of there being an enormous resource under this that nobody had ever drilled into. And so we saw this as a chance to use existing interconnection grid tie infrastructure to come in and apply our models. And in less than 12 months from acquisition, we were able to bring that plant back to its full nameplate capacity. And we now have proven enough resource in the subsurface to begin building multiple expansions on site. And so we'll be breaking ground on second and third phases soon. And that was a way to really pull forward. We're delivering electrons today to the grid in a way that we couldn't have done if we were just waiting for the standard processes.
I would maybe add at a kind of practical, so it is sort of regulatory and it's an efficiency thing. I think the whole of Europe probably suffers, but certainly in the UK acutely from transmission, lack of transmission. Interconnectivity is that we already constrain large amounts of renewable power off purely because of grid constraints. And there's a double whammy there, is that you're wasting power that you bought, that's clean energy, you're not getting it to the load centers, but it's actually having to be replaced in the load centers by gas. So, I mean, that definitely falls into an efficiency one. And it's complex in terms of planning for transmission going through countrysides and things. And in fact, I think the regulator itself, it's difficult for transmission operators to be investing at risk. So we are suffering the consequence of that already in the UK, is inefficient build out of grid to support what a future energy system needs to look like.
Great question, and I really like the answer so far, energy efficiency. And I can talk and also give an example of Europe. So we are all about energy efficiency. We electrify industries. Just to give an example, and I will become a little bit technical here. So 45% of the energy used in the world runs through motors. Now, we provide high efficiency motors which can save up to 90% of energy consumption, and this is measurable. And at the same time, Europe, there's a study by the International Energy Agency, which I think has been published by the end of March, or is about to be published, which shows that more than 25% of the data center installed base in Europe, and this is all builds, is extremely highly inefficient. So what collocator, hyperscalers, data center operators are doing is retrofit, and we're receiving a lot of requests for what is the best technology that we can implement in that retrofitting in terms of energy efficiency. How, without going and building new infrastructure, can we make the most of our existing infrastructure? And again, motors, variable speed drives, there's a dozen of technologies that exist today that can help improve that energy efficiency of existing installed capacity today.
So shifting a little bit on the cost of capital, Josh, this probably touches first to you, but I'm also really curious how the other three of you are seeing it. Obviously, we've had a lot of energy shocks in the last few years, whether it started with Russia. Obviously, Iran now is really shaking things up, and it's fundamentally shifting people's calculus around a whole lot of things, obviously. I'm curious how you're seeing that affect the cost of capital, and if you're raising, how you're seeing that affect the conversations you're having around where is capital wanting to play and what is being unlocked that maybe 3 months ago wasn't unlocked or fundamentally has flipped the other direction. And then Anna, for you, where are you seeing, ABB, you've got tentacles in everything, so where are you seeing changes happening and where do you think those go in the next 3 to 6 months, obviously acknowledging that we have no idea where the Iran war situation is going to go in the next 3 to 6 months?
I mean, I can start. I don't think we should sugarcoat it. These are risk assets.
Yep.
When events like this happen, risk premia go up, DCFs go down. I think it's on the margin harder to form capital. It delays deployments. It's not a good thing. You had the countervailing force right before this that the hyperscalers have all revised up their CapEx guidance. And I think if we're talking about powering AI, that those companies are still seeing very robust ability to get rounds priced and deploy. So I don't think the Iran situation is good for any of this. But else the other note here, these are sort of secular themes with some of the largest companies in the world setting computing paradigm shift. So I don't know if we should completely emphasize cyclical shocks to commodities, but I don't think it's a valid conclusion that, like fossil fuels are up, that's really good for the deployment of renewables or long duration energy storage or some of these new technologies that we're investing against.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's complicated and nuanced. I do think there are some positive aspects to it that are impacting our industry. One is a return to real assets in the public markets. As a technology-enabled developer, we've always been in that kind of gray area. Is this venture backable? Is this private equity backable? And we're seeing a lot more interest in real assets. And it's hard to know, is that tied to some of those trends, or is this tied to what AI is doing to disrupt the moats of software? And so is that capital looking for somewhere to go? The other area is just the demand is so strong now in a way that it was not when most of these new geothermal companies started, that we're no longer competing with the marginal cost of existing assets. Right? It used to be if you're going to build our power plant, you're going to turn off some natural gas facility somewhere, and that was hard to compete with. But now that we're talking about new build, geothermal pencils out all day long against a new build natural gas facility. And so we're finding much less hesitation to move into these contracts and signing greenfield development. We're also seeing customers, hyperscalers in particular, willing to come forward with capital early in the development cycle. So to the question of cost of capital, to have a customer willing to prepay or provide equity into the project, those are great signals and great ways to lower that cost of capital. And maybe the last thing from our side is the ecosystem investors around this climate tech or energy tech industry, I think, has been maturing and bringing in more capital to fill some of those missing middle sections. So, for example, in our space, we've seen project finance deals for post-NTP construction come out in geothermal. We're excited to be announcing, actually tomorrow, the first pre-NTP non-recourse development capital facility in geothermal that we've had our first close on. And so these are dramatically lowering the cost of capital for us to build real assets.
Yeah, I mean, I'd only maybe add, I think it's too early with regards to Iran to really know what the impacts are. I mean, from us, I think we see, the UK is one of the, lead markets for us, and that's a result of UK government themselves through policy recognizing a need for this tapestry of 24/7. So we have, specific targeted support for us there that we're building commercial projects out against. I think the only other thing to probably recognize is clearly, renewables are a capital-intensive CapEx up front, so interest rates, lending rates going up, it will have direct feedback into cost of energy on the renewable side as well. So it's that side's not a good news story.
So from my side, from the supply side, I would say two things. First, the demand that data center is driving, regardless this energy shock, is unprecedented. I call it a once-in-a-generation situation that is happening. So that keeps moving. At the same time, the energy sector is supporting that growth. I was at CERAWeek a couple of weeks ago in the US, and every energy company already has a plan B, C, and D in terms of the diversification of oil and gas and everything else away from the area of conflict. Even Venezuela, Argentina, Australia, the west coast of the US. So they have a very detailed plan to try to counterbalance the potential energy shock. From an ABB supply chain standpoint, it's too early to say. We haven't seen any impact so far. Again, wait and see, we don't have a crystal ball. But we have a local-for-local strategy where several years ago, by nature that we are a highly decentralized organization, we have local supply chains. So we try to meet the customers where they are, and that even last year with the situation with the tariffs, we got some impact, but not compared to competitors, because we have robust supply chains, all over the world. So that is a positive on our side. On the rest, we keep a close eye and we keep monitoring the situation.
All right, we're coming up on the end here. I want to circle us back a little bit to the beginning, which was, how are we going to do all of this? And we're increasingly seeing some really interesting ideas that are maybe less feasible than some of the things, or maybe a little further off, whether it's space-based solar, space-based data centers, floating data centers. We're seeing a lot of behind-the-meter stuff. We're seeing all sorts of just innovation and ideas. And I'm curious, what would you suggest, each of you, kind of what's the most provocative but plausible thing that you see coming that could be a piece of this baseload 2.0, that could be a piece of either the short term or the mid to even longer term, but that fundamentally reshapes how we think about how this all gets done? Feel free to throw it as wild and crazy as you want with a little bit of backing behind it. I did not prep them on this question, by the way, so this is free-form.
Off script.
You might not be able to build as many data centers, and you might have to build smaller data centers. There's already a residential backlash. If there's inflation in consumer electricity prices, There was an announcement from Maine this morning, so you might have to just make do with less. AI adoption might just fall short.
I was going to maybe choose, it was maybe an easy one, but the ongoing situation in Iran, for Europeans anyway, if we see it continue and gas prices continue, I mean, we're kind of fortunate from a timing perspective, we're coming into summer, but next winter, high gas prices for Europeans will, I think, directly correlate towards action to try and speed up the pace of replacing that gas reliance. So it's not going to happen overnight, but gas prices, the higher they stay, the longer they stay, I think that should correlate through to how both policy moves and investment moves for finding solutions.
If you've been in the industry long enough, some of your hopes of radical change have dropped because you sort of know it's a slow, high inertia industry, like we mentioned. But I don't know that the energy industry has ever faced this much CapEx investment and planned CapEx investment in decades. And maybe the other comparables we have to this is what happened with shale gas in the United States. And it was remarkable how fast we overwrote all of the regulations in a bipartisan way to unlock this new energy source when there was that much support behind it. And so I wonder if we're being still too conservative and keeping the lid on our own kind of jumping fleas here, of not realizing that there might be more political and social will to radically overhaul some of the regulations and processes, especially around interconnection transmission, putting IoT devices all over the system to really understand where are those gaps, coordinating that across much larger regions and districts. I would suspect that there's actually a much faster ability to bring projects online than we currently allow ourselves to believe.
Two things from my perspective. One, I agree with Josh. I think there's a lot of work, and we're working a lot, including with startups today, and tomorrow we have a side event, a startup challenge. We continually look for new technologies across the electrical and cooling to help reduce energy consumption and also the footprint of the data centers. So whilst we don't have all the answers, we envisage significantly smaller data centers in the future. And then on building data centers in space, I cannot say that we are helping that yet, but we provide a lot of instrumentation controls to aerospace and a number of agencies that are working in building infrastructure in outer space. So this is real. We've been doing this for a number of years. So if they can help, a space station, they can build a data center as well. Why not? So the technology to build that in space exists.
So I think leaving us with a final thought, the thing that jumped out at me, those 4 answers that just came out, Anna, yours really did touch on some technology that's happening, that needs to happen. The other 3 really touched on the people side of things, which is around data centers and their social license to operate, around the engagement with communities and figuring out how do we do this, around the engagement with the political spectrum to change regulations. And I think that's a good walking note to just think about sort of what are the human sides of this energy revolution that needs to happen to really move baseload 2.0 forward. Because at the end of the day, a lot of it's going to come down to how we implement and how we let these things play out in our communities. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.